Hello, 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 friends. Nice to see you all. Hello to folks from Iran. Hello to folks from Paris. Happy Friday. Happy Saturday for some of you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. And thanks to everyone, especially for those of you who are joining us in the wee hours of the morning. I hope there are other Ethiopians in there. Hello, everyone. I see Canada. I see Rio. Belarus, that's awesome. Tajikistan, Colombia. Shout out to Colombia. I know things are not super easy over there. We're thinking of you. Also, not super easy for the folks in India. We are also thinking of you. But to get right to it, today we're going to dig into a new topic for the next few streams, InnerSource. Whereas last month we talked about what is open source software, why you'd want to use or contribute to it, how to do it safely, and what structures in a company can help with the process. Now, we're going to talk about what we can learn from how open source works. Not quite the code itself, but the process of open source software development. And with that, I'd like to bring in Zack back from our last stream, as well as Prem. Both of them are senior DevOps engineers. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hi, AJ. Thanks.
Hey, AJ. Thank you. So, Zack, before we get in, I think hello to everybody. Shout outs to everybody who's making time to jump in for this session. What we've got lined up for today's session is more towards a Q&A, where Zack and myself are going to be quizzing each other, understanding what is InnerSource and how our experience speaks to the different stakeholders that has been involved in their InnerSource journey. So without further ado, I think, Zack, my first question to you is, what is InnerSource and how different it is from open source, and how can organizations or companies benefit by going InnerSource?
Yeah, that's a great question and a perfect one to get us started so that folks can understand to all be on the same playing field here when we're talking about terminology like InnerSource and organization initiatives and all of that kind of stuff. So to get started with the first part of that question, InnerSource is essentially, if I boil it down to one sentence, it's the application of open source practices like code reusability and building communities around code from different places. And that's all applied inside of an organization. So the main differentiator, you asked about how is it different from open source?
Yeah.
Well, InnerSource is really inside of a company, behind the firewall, some people say. And so it's like open source inside the company. If we look at InnerSource, like how would that even work inside a company? Like companies, develop products, somebody's building a website, like they wouldn't InnerSource that to the company because that company's inside that company. They're not going to build other websites that look exactly like that one. Well, it starts to actually work if you break it down into smaller modules, smaller pieces, right? So let's say, we're building two websites for GitHub, for example. One of them is going to be our github.com, our main website, and then the other one is going to be like our support website. But maybe they both have a chat feature or something like that. Well, you don't have to write that code twice from two different teams, possibly even on two different technologies. You can just write it once and reuse it in both places. But you have to have this mindset across your whole organization and the visibility and transparency across your whole organization to be able to see those opportunities for consolidating, right? And so when I'm say consolidate, I'm talking about, just reusing a single piece of code instead of doing it. So it's a lot of people ask about like, well, what tool do I need to install to use InnerSource? It's not like that at all. It's more about a community. It's a way of working. It's a way of developing your products by looking at what exists first. Just like we should be looking at what open source exists first before we try and build stuff, we should also be looking at what InnerSource exists or can be created before we build stuff. So does that make sense? Answer your question?
Yeah. So my takeaway would be it's about having a common place to look for all the different projects where somebody could contribute or take advantage and not reinventing the wheel. Can that be summarized as that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary.
Yeah.
And I think that it's interesting because, like, when you think about like the benefit or why would I do it, you think more about like exactly what you said about like, well,
Mhm.
we don't want to reinvent the wheel, right?
Yeah.
But then when you think about what it feels like to actually do InnerSource, it
Mhm.
feels like a community of people from different spots in your organization, not just your team, working on a single piece of code.
Yeah.
Right. And it feels like managers collaborating together and talking about how they can get features done versus assigning it to a specific team. It's got to get done by a specific deadline. And otherwise, the whole train kind of comes off the tracks.
Right. I like the part where you say it's not about the tooling, it's the process in which how you use the toolings that's available to you within your organization. I think that's a great point to drive home there. Cool.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I've got a question for you then, if we're going to go back and forth, sort of ping pong quiz each other.
All right. Bring it on. Bring it on.
Yeah. So if we have a good understanding of what the definition of InnerSource is, like what we just talked about, then
Mhm.
how do you actually start practicing InnerSource? Like, what does that look like for like, this seems like a good idea, but what should I do?
That's a good one. I think they say the journey of 1,000 steps starts with one, the first step, and the first step is always the hardest. And I think, in my opinion, the first step towards adopting or embracing InnerSource is creating a culture of sharing, right? And I know it's very broad in terms of like, how do you start sharing? How do you create the culture? Because it's not something that is out of a book or something that you can instruct people, right? I think one quick way on how you can get started with creating a culture of sharing is creating communities of practice within the organization. And within GitHub itself, within our team, there is a great bunch of community of practice folks. I know, like, I've been blessed to work with these great individuals, the entire team, who has been spearheading specific subject matters in their community of practice area. So you've got people in let's say administration practice. That's Javier, and then yourself, who is in the open source and inner source. We've got Stefan, who's into migrations. We've got also the other Stefan is to actions. And I'm missing out a lot of names, but the entire group of team that we have created a community of practice verticals on different topics where we share and discuss about how can we better improve the solutions that we have, right? Not only solution, but also the tools. And the key criteria in collaboration or creating the culture of sharing is we created a place or a voice where it's heard. And this voice is in terms of the shared communication channel that we have, right? And this is Slack workspace. We also have repositories where it's open up for every folks who could contribute, who could share the ideas and influence the decisions that we make, right? And all of those activities that we have been doing is centered around building a healthy community within the organization, right? Because it's the same principle of open source where, as an example, if you have an excellent community, but if you have a code base that is not so good, the community is going to strive to make it better, right? Whereas the reverse is also true, where if you have an excellent code base, but if you don't have a community that gives too much attention to it, the code base is eventually going to die off, right? So in that same context, I think building the community, providing the voice for the community being heard through transparent channels has been a great influencer, as well as a first step to get started with embracing InnerSource.
Cool. Yeah. So if I was kind of summarize some of the ideas that you talked about at a high level, it sounds like building communities around code and having those communities really tend to or garden those code bases to keep them sort of evergreen, to keep them in a good spot. And then when you talk about what these communities are centered around, it's not just code, but it sounds also like we're talking about, maybe your organization is sort of linear in different groups, but then across those groups, there are these common, you call it, what did you say, verticals or something?
Yeah, verticals and domains. And I think the key thing with that community is we have talented individuals leading and safeguarding that community.
Mm-hmm.
So folks like Jared, James, and Matt Duff, who's been leading that domain. They've given us the freedom to create the practice areas and build that community around it. So I think it's a great shout out to all of those folks there. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. That's a shameless plug, I admit, but I think, hey, I got to do it. So, right. So my next question to you, since we spoke about community, right? Who do you think would be the most important stakeholder as a community to support this InnerSource initiative?
Most important stakeholder. Okay, so I'm gonna dodge that question only a little bit in that, as a parent, I've sort of learned that, oh, well, you're not supposed to like have a favorite child or anything like that, despite any feelings. So yeah, in terms of like most important, I could give you maybe the top 2 or 3. But yeah, so in terms of stakeholders in your organization that you're trying to get InnerSource moving in, I would say the first thing is really to look at the individuals that would make up these communities, right? So you could convince leadership, you could, make pretty PowerPoints that people clap at the end. But if you don't have folks on the ground who are actually dealing with these subjects that want to engage in a community of people that deal with that subject, then it won't work, right? It'll fall apart. You don't have a community without community members. And so there's that way to look at it. Another way to look at it, and I've seen it go both ways, is that if you don't have the leadership support and a specific real like sponsor, somebody who's really behind this and trumpeting the benefits and things like that at the leadership level, then they could find out about this. Several people from different product lines are meeting on this topic of, I don't know, how to deal with databases on the web and trying to optimize that. And, I think that's just a waste of time as a leader. So I'm going to ask them to stop doing that because it's not revenue generating activity. I'd rather them just focus on their product backlogs, which are moving too slow, or, just different things like that. And trying to optimize out, this sort of sharing. So you don't want leadership to stamp it out, so you need a leadership sponsor. You want a community, so you need community members. The other important stakeholder is, sometimes this isn't necessarily like leadership or a community member, but like a facilitator. Think about like a program manager, somebody like if you have an open source programs office, like we talked about last week on Friday on demo days, if you've got somebody managing how you consume and produce open source, maybe there's somebody on that team that would be interested in also managing InnerSource projects and how to build up those communities around the code there, and they can help provide structure and weight that leadership is maybe more willing to accept versus just like these hodgepodge ragtag groups of people that are trying to network with each other, but sort of don't have the visibility into other teams. And I'll just say, I'm saying all of these things as if your organization is very large, and that you have multiple products. Some organizations don't, and that doesn't mean that InnerSource isn't important there. Several parts of one product can use the same code, right? So it can be InnerSource that way, but it's just a lot easier to discover what's going on in InnerSource, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So you have like a steward or a group of stewards who's safeguarding that interest and providing clarity. Did I get that right?
Yeah, definitely. I like that illustration. That's a good example.
Nice.
So I've got a question for you.
Okay.
I mentioned I mentioned open source programs offices. I said, we talked about that last week on demo days. So, kind of with the perspective of InnerSource, or for people that didn't catch the last session, what is an OSPO? What's an open source programs office?
That's a good one. So I'm going to try my best to get the definition right.
Sure.
So OSPO, which is short for Open Source Program Office. Instead of giving a definition, I would like to clarify the responsibility of how important this group of individual or the OSPO team is going to be, because I think when we talk about open source or inner source, there's going to be many different definitions or explanation about what does inner source or open source mean to an organization. Because everybody understands that this is how open source is or this is how inner source is, but to clearly identify and align a definition towards the business goal of an organization is really very important, because you need a clear message. I'll give you an example. Let's say we are trying to navigate out of a maze, right? And I use this example all the time. So if I were to instruct somebody to safely get out of a maze, I would say face north, walk for about 15 minutes at a 6-minute pace, and then face east, and then walk another 20 minutes at a 7 kilometers per hour pace. Then you should be safely out. But my colleague would be giving the same instruction, but might have just simplified it to say that face forward, walk 20 steps, turn left, walk another 15 steps, and you should be out, right? So we're essentially saying the same message, but we are defining it a little bit differently, right? So I think OSPO provides the clarity in terms of what definition for inner source or open source means to an organization, right? And to come up with this clear definition, you will need different representatives. And this representative could be folks from engineering, folks from management, folks from human resource, legal team, as well as having some corporate sponsorship, right? Because once you have all of these different individuals chiming in and explaining about what inner source means, they come up with a well-thought definition for all stakeholders who might be impacted by the policies or the initiative that they're going to be doing, right? The individuals of the OSPO team, or the responsibilities of them, is to also be a catalyst to promote this cultural change or create this cultural awareness and sharing, right? And if I were to summarize it, I would say they are the voice that's going to represent the community, whether it's for the open source, the public community, to speak with the internal organization, or they're going to be the voice that represents the internal community to provide clarity around all efforts and goals about inner source. Yeah,
this is interesting. And so I'm not going to try and summarize that since you summarized it so nicely, but I do have a follow-up question. I'm thinking about how open source and inner source mirror each other, and how open source can be sort of chaotic. There's people coming in from everywhere. You don't know what group of people is working on what, and nobody can tell anybody what to do. Do organizations, do they have to change to that model where you can literally pick up your desk and switch teams and switch managers, just based on a whim, or can you still have an organization that maintains structure and order and planning and road mapping, but also do inner source? Do those two things even work together?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm glad we're not keeping scores. I think it depends on the scale of the organization and also its journey towards adopting open source and inner source, right? In most organizations, I believe OSPO starts off like a group of evangelists, like a virtual team, where they have, like you said, a time to meet and discuss about initiative and promote all the efforts that they are doing around open source and inner source for the organization. Once it gets a little bit more serious and we see the return on investment, and return on investment is a big word. You can't really quantify because there's no one magic wand where we can wave, and it says that this is how much you're going to get if you invest this much time in doing InnerSource or open source, right? So as soon as things get a little bit more serious and you get traction and you can quantify based on some metrics that you identify, I think it would be worthwhile exploring and formalizing an open source program office, so that the open source program office operates as a glue that binds the different community or different business units, and they keep alignment with the business overall business goal and how that business goal aligns with InnerSource open source initiatives. In since we're talking about InnerSource, I would say more towards InnerSource initiatives.
That makes sense. Yeah. And I think that gives me hope that if there's somebody managing sort of the alignment with the company strategy and things like that, that it's less likely to sort of get chopped off and seen as extracurricular, so to speak, but more something that's seen as an accelerant that can really, achieve the company's main targets, right?
Agreed. And I think to give you an example, like how important or how an OSPO could influence the business goal. Let's say if the company's business goal is to hire and retain talent, then they could, involve themselves in initiatives that review the toolings that they use, as well as awareness and education on how, the cool technology or the cool platforms being used to do software development or to roll out their businesses, right? So in that sense, they could speak with the HR team to say that, okay, maybe we need to change the job description, or maybe we need to say that these are the toolings that we're looking for, these are the skill set we're looking for. So we're looking for somebody who is involved in open source or someone who knows about InnerSource. We need those champions, so we want to do this. So they can speak to the HR folks. They can also speak with different engineering managers to say that, all right, okay, we want to roll out this initiative and we need the buy-in so that you have cross-department collaboration. And what this benefits is everybody wins, so that you don't need to reinvent the wheel and recreate the same library where one team creates a library and the other team leverages or helps to reduce the backlog of a specific team, right? So once you have those different individuals representing different stakeholders, I think coming up with initiative or speaking, even getting sponsorship, speaking to the corporate folks to say that, hey, we need this budget for running some InnerSource because it gives us X amount of, benefits. They are going to be that voice. So having that well thought, all round, complete OSPO team is going to be really, really very important, I would say.
Yeah. So I just want to call out a couple of things that I've seen going on in the chat, actually.
Yeah.
So we had one person that mentioned the InnerSourceCommons.org. I think that was Vincent. And so, yeah, Vincent, thanks for throwing that into the chat. So the InnerSourceCommons.org is a place to go to be able to see a community of people that are trying to implement InnerSource or have successfully implemented InnerSource at their company or previous companies. So these are the practitioners that are doing this. It's a great resource. They've got all these sort of like patterns and stuff. Like if you see this pattern in your organization, maybe you should try like this solution to make InnerSource work or to have InnerSource create a bigger impact. So that one, I just wanted to call that out and say that's a super good resource. So thanks for putting that in there.
Cool. All right. So I've got one for you, Zach.
Yeah, go for it.
We've seen the community aspect and the role of an OSPO. How would we technically implement or adopt InnerSource? How would it look like?
Yeah. So in terms of like, if your organization says, okay, yeah, I'm ready to adopt InnerSource, what are my first steps? I think there's a couple of things that you got to sort of get a handle on. Like, why are you doing InnerSource? Why does your company think that this is going to be of value? Is it for engineering efficiency? Is it for creating communities among your developers to connect people and create retention? Like really outlining those goals, like you mentioned, Prem, and writing those down and saying, okay, this is why we're doing it, so that if those are your convictions about why you're doing InnerSource, you can keep those and maintain those throughout the process and sort of reflect and say, okay, is this adding to my goal? Versus, InnerSource can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, just like open source. And so you don't want such a nebulous, general goal. So there's that strategy piece. And then another thing to do in terms of first steps is really identifying what projects or opportunities there are to be shared. So like if I am at a, financial banking company or something like that, and I look around and I go, well, gosh, between the different products that we offer, there's not a lot of overlap. There's not a lot of the same languages or technologies being used. Like what am I even going to InnerSource? Like, it's a great idea, but I don't have any projects that are really good potential. Maybe you look at something like in infrastructure, like a shared CI pipeline, right? Mm-hmm. So everybody's got to run tests. Everybody's got to check their code quality, the security, and things like that in their CI pipeline. So, could you build a CI pipeline that is a base pipeline that you can reuse? It doesn't matter your technology, GitHub Actions, Jenkins, whatever. You can create that workflow, share that workflow with the other product members on your team, on different teams, different products, and say, hey, this is what we use. And maybe they have an improvement. Maybe they say, oh yeah, we do something similar to that, but we also, we have a linter in ours and we check for style, and so that all of our style is really consistent and readable too. And okay, yeah, I think I want to add that back in. That's the beginnings of an InnerSource project with the beginnings of contribution across multiple teams. You see the value starting to build up here. And the quality of the piece of software that you're reusing also increases there. So that's a good way, I think, to see some of the starters of the actual tangible benefits. And then, like we've been mentioning, we've been talking about like InnerSource champions, folks that work in an OSPO or leadership sponsors for this. Really identifying who those folks are, write that down. When I say write this down, like just start a repo in your organization called InnerSource and just like start putting this stuff in there, and making it visible to other folks, so you can start to build this community of people that care about the goal that you're trying to accomplish here. And then I think as you start to grow in maturity, like new problems start to arise. Like, okay, so you figured out your first couple of projects. That's great. Once you've got, maybe 5, 6, 10, 20 projects. Okay, well, now this is not just like a word of mouth thing. We can tell everybody about that one project that everyone's sharing. How do we discover what all of these projects are? And so new problems start to arise that you have to try and figure out how to do that. And so there may be an upcoming session on talking about discoverability and finding InnerSource projects. So I guess stay tuned for that. The other thing,
it's a sneak peek you're giving for the next.
Probably not supposed to leak this stuff out, but there it is. Okay. And then, just the other thing that I would mention is making sure that the transparency that you were talking about is compatible with your organization, right? So I've worked with some governments and government agencies that want to do InnerSourcing. Like they're very locked down, very secure on things. And so, but even in their organization, they can see value in sharing with specific groups at an appropriate time, where there's the authority to actually share that. And so I think lowering that barrier to collaborate, everybody's using the same source control tool, or everybody has access to log in to see where code is. But maybe they don't have permissions to see all the code, but they have permissions to see the code that's acceptable for anyone to see. Those types of activities of just lowering that barrier to collaborate is going to be really important.
Cool. Nice.
Yeah. I guess the other thing that I didn't mention was the communications. So you should probably be talking about this. You should probably be sharing the fact that you're working on InnerSource, that you're starting these shared projects. I think if you try to imagine a organization that does InnerSource really well, but nobody talks about it, nobody shares about InnerSource, like, then how does anyone know about it, right? So it's just like, it's an incompatible vision. So you have to sort of put your neck out there a little bit, be a little bit vulnerable, and say, hey, we're doing this sharing thing. We're trying to do it in a very secure and in a way that's going to impact the business in a positive way, not create, just massive amounts of risk with no benefit or anything.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So creating the culture of sharing as
Yep.
Nice.
So yeah, but I've got a question to turn it back to you.
Okay.
So we've talked a lot about like what to do and different steps and what like a whole initiative looks like in the different parts through different parts of the maturity. But like, if let's say I'm in a very data-driven organization, like most tech companies today, how do I go about an InnerSource initiative where I can like measure some success criteria? Like maybe my leadership sponsor wants to see an Excel spreadsheet with, 3 to 5 bullets on it that are either red or green, and, wants a status update every month. Like, what's the right things to set as our like success criteria, or what do we measure when we're trying to set up metrics for like InnerSource?
Wow. That's a tough one.
It's big.
Yes, and I don't have a magic number or magic criteria to say that, okay, this is, if you measure X, you are doing it right. First, I think that's a really great question, because I think, in my opinion, the InnerSource matrix need to match the goal of why you are going to be doing InnerSource in the first place. And from that larger question, we can drill down to make it a little bit more specific. For example, if you want to measure developer efficiency, or you want to measure the amount of reuse of projects, that can translate or compute back into a feature velocity on how fast you release features, or you release your new versions of the product, right? So if you have a greater goal and you could, let's say, make it more granular, you will be able to come up with a matrix that is aligned, very specific to why you want to be doing InnerSource in the first place, right? So as an example, I think I also need to be very realistic when we talk about InnerSource. Even if you can achieve 10% or less than 10% of contribution for your department's project from a different department, that is already a great win, because every department is going to have their own deliverables and backlog to burn and deliver. But achieving that almost 10% or X percentage contribution from another team is already considered a win, right? And over time, as the departments and the teams mature with the InnerSource culture and journey, that number will organically grow, right? And that becomes the organization's culture, and on how they share, how they contribute, and learn from each other's skill set, right? So I would say, as a starter, a good matrix to consider would be how much of collaboration is happening between the groups or the departments. So if we can quantify that to say that I've received X number of pull requests from team members who are not direct teammates, that's a good number to quantify. Keeping track of number of features that we are releasing, because if before doing InnerSource we were releasing 3 features in a quarter, and because we did InnerSource, after that we were able to leverage or crowdsource the skill set required to burn the backlog, we are able to push 6, 7, or 8 features. That's also a good positive number, right?
Yeah.
And then also the amount of project reuse. So this is lining up from the earlier answer you gave me about making the projects discoverable and lowering the barrier to collaborate. So let's say if you launch like a listing or a page where all of the InnerSource projects are listed, if the number of the project is also increasing, that's also a good positive indicator to show that any efforts that you're doing is headed in the right direction. Of course, these are high-level groups. You can always, revise and see how you are, progressing. I say that because business goals evolve, right? Companies evolve, they have their own enterprise DNAs, and as the business grows, they also evolve and adopt. Based on that, when you have a good OSPO team, they will be able to align initiatives and come up with key success matrix to say that, all right, by this initiative, by doing InnerSource, we were able to retain X amount of talents, or we hired X amount of new talents. And because of that, the benefits on, let's say, conversion and reach benefits were greater, because we didn't need to spend X amount of dollars in training, because everybody learned from each other in an organic way. Maybe that's not a great example, but at least you have the conversion in that sense, right? And also, like, number of features, we didn't reuse code, so we used whatever time that developers had. Instead of reinventing the wheel, we were churning out more new features at the same amount of time. So those are some good indicators or metrics that we could use. Of course, to keep track of the matrix, you need like a checklist, or maybe like a starting checklist, right? So I would also share that, number of issues being open in a repository is also a good thing, because it's all about the data and how you massage the data and make meaningful decisions out of those data. So as an example, let's say if a department is if a team is building a core component, a core library, and a lot of different teams are actually opening pull requests or opening up an issue saying that this particular feature is buggy, although it sounds negative, but it also sends a message to say that people are relying on that system. People are relying on the feature, and there is traction, right? So it's how you translate those metrics into meaningful data that you could make real-time decisions.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It seems like it could be a little bit on the dangerous side to just like set up some metrics and let people just interpret those for whatever they are, but to instead really add some support around the metric and to really kind of give the context to it. So
yes. And one more thing about metrics, I agree it's a very dangerous thing, because it also grows. It's a living thing with the project, because a project that's newly being started, you will have a lot of contribution and you will see numbers growing up, and the volume is adding on. But as the project matures and it's more stable and it gets into a maintenance mode, those numbers need to be translated differently, because you're not going to get a lot of contribution because it's already stable. It's doing what it's supposed to do in a very stable way, right? So you need to always revisit at specific milestones and define whether the matrix that you have specified, is it still valid? Is it still bring the right meaning to say that, are you doing InnerSource the right way or not?
Yeah, that makes me think about at a previous company that I worked at, I did, this is starting off in engineering, I did a lot of maintenance work on existing projects, and they always like labeled each of the projects in repositories and stuff like that. Either this is like a greenfield project, like totally new exploration, or this is a brownfield project where it's like, this is very stable, this is very reliable and trusted. And so we sort of made changes differently to those different projects as they were labeled that way. I could see how that would benefit in an InnerSource context as well, where you sort of label like, oh, this is a new InnerSource project. Lots of contributions, lots of unstructured activity, and direction is still being determined and things like that, and things are moving quickly. Whereas maybe a project that may two of your biggest products rely on, which is more stable and trusted, like you don't want to make big breaking changes there or anything like that, or at least be cautious when you do over communicate.
Yeah. I think having new documentations being created or documentations being updated could also be a good matrix, because you're adding more knowledge, right? That's something that we don't usually think of, having documentation or number of documentation around how a project is being used or developed. That could also make some meaningful matrix, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I love that, because documentation is good for business and it's good for the developer, right? If you think about it from the business mindset, documentation is great because you can put a resource on a project that they haven't seen before, and there's a great path already laid out for them to be able to get started, learn about the project, learn how it works, because you have all that documentation there. And then from the developer perspective, it's good because when you're thrown on a project, you know which way is up, right? And if that project is an InnerSource project, it also gives you more options for mobility to move around the company. Maybe you don't want to work on your team anymore. You'd rather work on this other team, and they use that InnerSource project that as well. So you can sort of advertise yourself to that team as like, hey, I'd like to do an internal transfer here. And I actually already know some of the projects and if contributed to some of the projects that you use, like that's got to be a pretty big gold star in terms of for that hiring manager to say, oh, okay, yeah, that's a great head start.
Yeah. And I think I would say InnerSource or like the contribution does not necessarily need to be on code. It could be documentation. It could be about knowledge sharing. It could be opening up, your team to share how your team has a workflow, or what is the process that what are the projects that you've tried, what are the learnings. So that is also considered as InnerSource, and it doesn't necessarily need to be around code or contribution to code.
Yeah, awesome point. But I feel like so many things are as code now, right? So you have your infrastructure as code, your documentation is code, your product is like that. I always feel like the InnerSource projects I work on are code, but yeah, definitely keeping an eye out for the ones that aren't code specifically.
Agreed.
So cool. We did have a comment in the chat that a couple of people actually mentioned it a little while ago, and they're talking about Slack, which is a chat tool if you're not familiar with it, and like, is that InnerSource, like putting everything in a Slack channel or Teams channel, whatever communication tool you use. And I think that actually aligns really well with the point that you just made about it's not always code, right? Like being able to create a community of practice around either security or around how to, have high quality on your project or documentation. Putting even all of that and joining around a Slack channel or whatever is, it's definitely an example of InnerSourcing ideas and things like that. So good call out from folks there. Cool.
Nice.
Yeah.
So there's a question in the chat. From Vincent, what kind of tools to improve the discovery of InnerSource projects inside the company?
Yeah. Thanks for asking that, Vincent. That's actually something that we're going to be talking about at an upcoming demo day. So I don't want to spoil it for that team, but I will give you the teaser that, if you look over at the InnerSource Commons website, SAP has contributed a tool that actually gives you a project portal. And so, later on in future demo days, they're actually going to dive into that, look at the code, and help folks who are participating in that demo days to check it out. So, yeah.
So the link is already dropped by Javier. Javier just shared it to the project portal.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks.
So Zack, we've been speaking about a lot of the items, and I think it's only fitting that we have like a checklist to help folks who've been following the friendly banter that we had going back and forth. There's a lot of info. So where can we find this checklist, or do we have something that we could share with the folks so that they have a takeaway? Like, if they want to create an FAQ about InnerSource within the organization, what can they do to get started? Do you have something for them?
Yeah, let me go ahead and bring it up now, actually.
Awesome.
Just going to share my screen here. Awesome. Okay, I see that you folks can see that. So what we're looking at here is a repository that we've put together, and this is public, so you can take a look at it. It's just github.com/demo-days/InnerSource-FAQ-template. And so here there's a lot of different resources actually, as well as a GitHub page. So the idea is that you could take this, fill out some of the content. I'm just going to put up the GitHub page that this generates here. You could fill out a lot of the content in here to help outline and start your own InnerSource initiative within your organization. So this is actually a takeaway for you folks to be able to help kind of put structure and thought behind the different things that we talked about today, and apply that to your organization and your InnerSource movement there.
Yeah. So is there a way where we could drop that in the chat?
Yeah, we'll take a look at that. While we're trying to do that, Prem, do you want to kind of go through some of the different section headers here and explain what we've got going on?
Yeah, so I think what we can do is, let me get to that repository. So this repository, you should InnerSource this repository, right? So this is going to be a living FAQ documentation where we have sections on how do you establish an open source program office, what is the role and responsibility, what could be the potential structure, what's the relationship between management, the org chart, and we also have some further reading on the OSPO. And then the section under defining InnerSource strategy, Zack, if you could help click on the second link, the sub point. Yeah. So we've got the maturity assessment in terms of what are your strategies that you currently have, what are the manifesto components, so meaning what do you want to include as bullet points in terms of what this vision or strategy of InnerSource mean, and trying to make an return on investment case where, like, if we do InnerSource, we should be able to achieve X amount of benefits and so on, right? And then I've also included a bit of InnerSource workflows. So this is more like establishing workflows on how you would open InnerSource your projects. How can you contribute to a different department or different teams project, as well as if you're planning to launch an InnerSource repository or InnerSource projects, what you need to consider and think of, right? And then under monitoring the InnerSource initiative, again, there's some good further reading. I did not explicitly put in tools or matrix because it's going to be very specific to your business goals and your organization. Beyond that, I think I've also put in like paying it forward, because it would be really cool for you folks or your organization, your enterprise, to share your InnerSource journey. Publish a blog, speak with your marketing team, speak with your branding team, and share your journey, share your knowledge, because we're all in this together, right? So I think that's how you create the community, and you could learn from each other's challenges, and that's a very neat way. And beyond that, under the appendix, we have a lot of resources, blogs from GitHub. I also have the one where Zack, you wrote about InnerSource. Yeah. So that's a starting template. So you could just go to the repository and click on use this template. So you could clone the repository directly into your accounts, your organization accounts or so. And you can deploy it as a GitHub page, promote it internally so that, contribute to the document and create a nice community around InnerSourcing. Cool.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that, Prem. I'm thinking back to the different times that I've actually helped folks implement InnerSource in their company, and this template really hits on a lot of the points of sort of like, okay, well, the business leadership came back to us and said, what's the ROI on this? Like, why are we going to invest time and money into this? So yeah. It looks like we also have another message in the chat from Daryl about this being really timely. I'm really glad that this has worked for you.
Yeah, we're glad. Thanks, Daryl.
Yeah. Defining strategy and building out that InnerSource tooling is really important. And again, it's so much easier if we just do that together. The InnerSource details of your projects can look so different from organization to organization, but how you run InnerSource at an organization can actually be really similar. So those are opportunities for open sourcing things. And like we had mentioned, as well as in the chat, as well as in the repo, there's the InnerSource Commons .org as well for that community. They have a Slack channel totally dedicated to asking people questions. So Daryl, you might want to jump in there if you're not already. And yeah, so this is something that GitHub can also do too. So we've got a professional services organization Prem and I are both a part of. And so if you'd like folks like us to help out, or you have any questions for sales about like GitHub, maybe you guys are on a different platform and you'd like to like fork these repos and use GitHub pages like we talked about today. There's a QR code actually down the, at least on my screen, it's the bottom left-hand corner. You can open up your camera app with your phone and take a picture of that. That'll take you to the website to be able to get in contact with somebody that can do a demo for you of kind of what GitHub has to offer, if that's something that you're interested in. There's obviously no obligation or anything. We just thank you guys for joining us today, for being able to talk about InnerSource. It's a topic that I'm really passionate about. I work on, and it's my day job to do this, and same as Prem. So, and thank you, Prem, for answering all the quiz questions and doing a great job. I love the content that you put together here. Yeah,
thanks, Zack. I think it was a great Q&A session we had, and I believe it did reach out to the community, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. It was a great session, so thank you for having me as well.
Yeah, so we've also teased several times, as prompted in the chat, about what's coming up next. So do check out our GitHub LinkedIn events page, and you can actually just go ahead and say that you're going to attend, and it'll remind you about our next session, I believe going on next Friday, also about InnerSource. So this is a topic that you found interesting.
Cool. So our colleagues, Jamie, Gus, Erica, Rowena, Chris, everybody's going to be getting you folks on the right track. So shout out to every one of them.
Yeah, should be a good time. And thank all of you guys for participating in the chat. We'll see you next time.
All right.
Moshi